Hello, hello. So I want to talk to you about behaviours under stress, and this is another one of these old favourites of mine because it goes right back to what I see as the prime period for learning about my own mindset and personal development and how I am as a person. So it goes back to when I first got to the level in my job as like a quote unquote junior doctor in emergency medicine. But then there's a point you reach in seniority where you're not the most senior doctor that works in the department, but at times during the day, so when you get to very late in the evening time or in the overnight period, then you essentially become the most senior doctor in the certainly in the department, sometimes in the building as well, depending on the circumstances. So that was a real watershed point for me in terms of the things I was kind of exposed to, the things I had to learn to deal with, both clinical and interpersonal. And, and I learned a lot from both sides of that equation, clinical stuff and interpersonal stuff. From essentially being in a position where I kind of had to do things, and even I would have the boss would be there that I could call if I needed them, but you could guarantee it was going to be anything up to half an hour before they physically arrived next to you to help you. So it was a kind of scary, enlightening, enriching time all wrapped into one. So I remember that this one particular nugget came from about 360-degree feedback, and I'm sure most people who are watching or listening to this will be familiar with the concept of 360-degree feedback. So you have to do it in most industries, don't you? Where you essentially will approach the people that you work with or come into contact with on a regular basis and ask them to give you feedback on various different aspects of your performance, positive and negative. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? I know earlier in my career it was all about just getting it done and who can I approach that's going to give me nice feedback, and um, it gets a bit harder as you sort of ascend in seniority. No matter what organization you work in, you are inevitably not going to be able to please everyone with what you do. And so I remember there was a watershed moment from that point of view as well, where all of a sudden I would get, it was generally pretty positive. You might get the odd little bit of constructive feedback, which was totally fair. But I remember getting something back about behaviours under stress, and chatting it over with my supervisor at the time, who was very good. Like she was good. She was very kind of matter of fact. Wasn't kind of overly aware of perhaps the kind of emotional attachment to feedback sometimes, so she could deliver feedback in a bit of a not intentionally harsh way, but just a very kind of blunt matter of fact way, which I kind of had to adapt to. But that was one of the things I got, was that I needed to be more aware of my behaviours under stress sometimes. And specifically, that was a tendency I had at the time to get a little bit snappy, where I was feeling like I was a bit stressed and a bit overwhelmed. And I think in retrospect, you can look back at those times and go, yeah, I was that that was overwhelm. Essentially, I had too much going on. I had too much of my own patient caseload. I had problems that those patients had that I hadn't figured out a plan for yet. I was also responsible for the other patients in the department that I hadn't had direct involvement with as well. So the more junior members of the team would be coming to me to ask me questions about their patients. I might, potentially might have to go and review those patients as well, but at the very least, I'm going to be hearing all about that patient's story and what information we have available on them, and figuring out the best way forward for them as well. And let's also bear in mind that that's not the only thing that I have to do. I have basically an open revolving door of people can just attend whenever they want, if they need to. People coming in by ambulances, so it's a real, if you had to design a system to make people overwhelmed, then you couldn't really design a much better system, to be honest. So it was a lot of responsibility, especially when I was more junior at doing this. I found it harder. I found it a bit easier as I got more senior and a bit more capable from all aspects, I suppose. But I remember a couple of interactions, and it was usually if it was going to be a little mini flashpoint. I was never one to have massive disagreements with people. It's not really how I'm wired. Um, but I remember having a couple of little minor disagreements with one person, just because of our personalities and our way of projecting ourselves were just completely at odds with each other. So if I was going to have a little flashpoint with someone, it was going to be this person. But the 98% of the time we got on really, really well, but it was just on little occasions we had little fallings out. And I had a bit of a tendency to get a bit snappy with them, and I did know that, but certainly before I was more aware of why it was happening, and that I was even kind of doing it, I was very, very good at kidding myself and kind of going, well, they deserved it. They deserved it. It seems a bit silly now when I'm saying it now. So it did. It took a little bit of external feedback and chatting about it to kind of realise that, yeah, actually the way I reacted wasn't really helpful. It felt like it was justified in the moment, but actually I haven't really helped anything by doing it. So one of the more useful things, because it's hard to not react in the moment. I think it's almost like a bit of a reflex, and it's that whole psychological thing, isn't it, about how our emotional brain will react way before our rational brain does. It's a little bit like the old-fashioned athletics races, um, where if you stood at the finish line of the 100 meters and the starter fired the pistol, you would see the flash of the pistol the before you heard the noise of it. And that is just purely because light travels faster than sound, and it's a little bit like that. The difference between the emotional and the rational brain is that is the speed. So it's what can you do to help with that, I guess. So building that awareness that you do that when you're stressed and overwhelmed is one thing. So being aware of what your behaviours under stress are, and it might be you either have to ask the people around you that you trust to give you honest feedback and constructive feedback. What am I like when I'm stressed? Because you might be completely unaware, or you might be aware and then you're justifying it in the aftermath, like I was. Um, or there's kind of more formal feedback exercises. It might be that you have to do that as part of your role, like I do, whether I want to or not. And you might get some insights back on your behaviours under stress from that as well. And then you need to think about the anatomy of that, I suppose. And I think I had to double check before I started talking about this, but Viktor Frankl had talked about that, the gap between stimulus and response. And that's where a lot of the learning about this comes from. It's allowing yourself to have a little bit of a pause at that point, and it may be something that with practice you can do quite skillfully. Is that you feel that familiar urge to react coming up on yourself, and you just take that you take that opportunity to allow a pause, and it might be that you just count to 5 or 10, or that maybe you remove yourself from the situation for 30, 60 seconds if you can. That little bit of a pause just allows your rational brain to catch up with your emotional brain, and the difference that your response will be is quite remarkable. And actually, as I was talking there, I was just remembering another piece of advice that I was given about this. It was the same hospital, same department, but a different supervisor, so different perspective on the same thing. And I remember that supervisor giving me a bit of a really, really good tip, which I still use to this day where I need to. And he was talking about, if he was talking about it in the context of conflict, which is another one of these situations where potentially you could react rather than respond. And he had kind of said, a good thing to do is take it away from wherever you happen to be at the time, if it's appropriate to do so. And he gave a specific example that I won't share, but essentially, he said he was really, really angry with this particular person, and he really strongly wanted to give them a piece of his mind, essentially tell them what he thought of them. So walked them to a room nearby, and then just said, even in the 10, 15, 20 seconds that it took them to walk to the room that they were going to, he had calmed down so much. And so the difference between, if he had not introduced that pause and had just told them what he thought of them there and then, both in a public place in the middle of the department, and also the content of which maybe wasn't ideal. And then, where you could actually have a rational discussion about it, or you could certainly more likely to have a rational discussion about it. So yeah, that was just some reflections on my own kind of history on this. And I know now I tend to do a lot more of this now in terms of a sort of parenting context. I pick up on a lot of this stuff when I do the journaling in the morning time, and often, if there's something that didn't go well the previous day, it's usually because I've picked up that I've gotten a bit reactive, maybe with my other half, maybe with the kids as well. And I try and approach everything in a parenting context as calmly as humanly possible, because I don't want them to kind of tune out everything I'm saying just purely because I'm raising my voice or sounding annoyed. I want those times to only be where it's kind of safety critical, essentially. So actually, if I'm raising my voice, it means something very important rather than just that, Daryl raises his voice all the time, which I don't want to be that kind of parent. And so now I reflect on those things sometimes where I kind of go, actually I reacted there rather than responded. I let the fact that I was overwhelmed, I had lots going on in the house. I'd maybe just got in from work. I was trying to go to work. We were running late for something. Perhaps we were just all falling out with each other in the house. So those are most commonly the things that I reflect on now, especially now that, for the past couple of months, I don't work in a sort of busy, overwhelming clinical environment at the moment. There are elements of my current job that can get a little bit overwhelming sometimes. If I'm on a difficult call with someone who's got a lot of problems, I've got a really complex report to write up that's got a lot of facets to it. I need to make some decisions about certain aspects of that. I maybe need to speak to someone for a bit of advice about it. Those things can be quite overwhelming, especially if you know, I'm going to run over my time, I'm going to miss my train. There's all sorts of things. There's all sorts of bits that can be thrown into the mix. So it's how can you, the key thing really is that stimulus response, that the gap. How do you make that gap a little bit wider? What can you do there to skew the ratio of responding and reacting, of emotional and intellectual? You want your response to be more, and given that there's no survival at stake here, how can you make your response more intellectual than emotional? Yeah. So let me know. Let me know what you think. I want to know, how do you behave under stress? Do you know? If you don't know, how are you going to find out? Maybe you've approached people to ask them how you behave under stress. If you haven't done, give it a try. Let me know what they tell you. Try introducing that little gap between the stimulus and the response, and let me know how you get on. And I'll speak to you all soon.